This project is called Natural Hazards and Resilience in Complex Urban Systems. I'm the project lead. Annette Crone, who's online, is the key project coordinator, but also John Feen is essentially part of the lead coordinating group with us. Essentially, what I want to do today is give a bit of background, talk through the aims, the team, and the approach, and I might leave the introductions to a few slides in where we can go around the team and everyone can introduce each other. It's probably at that point useful to hear from the stakeholders perhaps as well, who they are and their interest in the project. And then there's plenty of opportunity later on for discussion about the project and for us to get advice from the stakeholder group. So I guess a key part of the background for this project is the fact that Australia is essentially an urban nation, an urban society. 86% of the population lives in a major urban centre, and within those urban centres, around half the population lives in relatively low density suburbs. Most population growth happens in major cities, and increasingly in some of the fast growing coastal cities, though all of the major cities are located on coastlines. Exposure to natural hazards is often an element of urban living, whether it's particularly extreme heat, which is exacerbated by urbanisation, intensive flooding. A number of urban areas are exposed to cyclones, but also obviously bushfires as well. And the complexity of urban systems means that the impact of natural hazards can be multi-dimensional, it can cascade and compound, and so the complexity of the types of impacts that may be experienced in cities, including the scale of those potential impacts, is a real challenge, especially if we anticipate that climate change will exacerbate the frequency and intensity of hazards. So this project is motivated by the need for understanding of the causes and effects of disaster risk, particularly within urban areas, kind of questions of systemic vulnerability, so not just the direct impact in a particular location on a particular specifically affected community, but how impacts on particular urban systems can expand and cascade and have flow-on effects throughout networks, throughout systems, and at the metropolitan scale, including the intensity and scale of impacts. So it could be a relatively modest event, but because of these cascading risks, could have quite substantial systemic impacts. I guess we're also cognizant of the complex and tightly interconnected dimensions of urban systems, how interwoven many different kind of aspects of urban infrastructure, urban institutions are. If we think of, say, the electricity network, for example, as a pretty prime and critical piece of infrastructure that's interconnected in many complex ways through the generation, transmission, and sites of distribution, but also in the ways that electricity is an essential necessity for all emergency response systems as well. We need to think about the diversity of urban systems, their spatial structure and distribution, economic, social, cultural, political dimensions. The fact that cities are changing through rapid urbanisation, demographic shifts, whether that's migration of various types, including international inward migration, but also experiencing new phenomena due to climate change. And I think the heat island effect is a good example of that among some of the other risks that are likely to increase in the future. And in addition to their sort of economic and social complexity, there are many different stakeholders in cities: governments, businesses, communities, other forms of civil society, whose choices, decisions, agendas shape the way the cities develop. And this is kind of reflected in the UNDP definition of urban resilience around the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems to adapt, survive, and thrive, irrespective of what kind of stresses and shocks they experience. So I guess we're working around that notion of urban resilience as being a multi-dimensional and multi-sectoral kind of phenomenon or challenge that affects individuals all the way through to businesses and systems. So part of the background to the project, but further background, is around the question of resilience strategies and impacts. What strategies can be pursued and what investments might be relevant and appropriate to improve the resilience of communities, understanding the vulnerabilities to these multi-dimensional and cascading disaster impacts, and better understanding of how to build urban resilience and reduce disaster risk. And it's a pretty simple diagram, I think it's fair to say, on the right-hand side there, but we're thinking across 4 sectors or four factors in terms of how we're thinking about complex urban systems. There's the community resilience and exposure, and also the more systemic urban resilience, as well as the kind of investments that can improve urban resilience, and the nature of potentially compounding kinds of disasters and risks that cities and urban systems are exposed to. So next slide. Thanks, Annette. So in terms of the specific aims of the project, we're hoping to contribute to the following long-term impacts, both for NHRA and for communities and disaster resilience sector organisations. Increased understanding and capacities in relation to disaster resilience and other and for other agencies responding to multidimensional disasters. Increased adaptive capacity to reduce the impacts of events in major urban areas. The question of partnerships and how they can be effectively developed between disaster and resilience agencies, communities, and wider stakeholders who may not necessarily be emergency focused in what they do, but are key elements of urban systems and have a responsibility to respond, and may even have their own disaster or risk response plans, which need to be coordinated with the more hands-on emergency sector, and how they can all work together to mitigate the impacts of compound disasters. And then lastly, there's the more hands-on question of mitigating risks around the multidimensional hazard events. And I think really an emphasis of this project is that multidimensionality. We're not just looking at bushfires in isolation or floods in isolation, but also the multidimensional potential of hazard events, and also how that also impacts on recovery. So the different multidimensionalities of recovery from disaster events. Okay, we might just quickly go around the Zoom room and introduce some of the project team. Maybe I'll start with myself. I'm Jago Dodson. I'm currently the director of the Urban Futures Enabling Impact Platform at RMIT University, which that role involves me connecting researchers across the university around urban futures themes to support impact for external collaborators and partners. I have a background in urban planning, housing, transport, urban governance, infrastructure, and energy. And I've been at RMIT for almost 10 years now, and really keen to work on this project. So I might hand over to Annette next.
Yep, thanks, Jago. Yeah, my name is Annette Krohn. I'm a senior research fellow at the Center for Urban Research here at RMIT. And yeah, my background is urban planning as well. And I've worked in projects on urban planning, urban governance, also disaster risk related, to planning and transport projects. And yeah, I'm also quite interested in getting the definition of what urban actually means and how we can work with, the disaster risk. And I'll just go along with the slides and hand over the photos and hand over to John.
Thank you, Annette. I'm John Feen. I'm a professor of practice in the School of Architecture and Urban Design at RMIT. I'm the person coordinating the first work package, and I'll be telling you a little bit more about that. But it is the one where we're actually going to come to a conclusion about what urban resilience might mean in Australia and appropriate and relevant strategies for achieving it.
I'm Esther Charlesworth. I'm also a professor in the School of Architecture and Urban Design, where I founded the Master of Disaster Design and Development degree in the Humanitarian Architecture and Research Bureau. I'm involved in this project in really the dissemination of the research outputs, I think, in work package 4. So great to be involved.
Hi, I'm Leila Rajifar. I am a lecturer in Master of Disaster Design and Development, and I teach courses like building urban resilience, geospatial information systems for disaster management, systemic design for SDGs, and etc. My research background and my PhD was focused on modeling disaster resilience, developing indexes, and so far. My current research is mostly focused on smart resilient cities and the role of digital solutions in operationalizing resilience in urban systems. I look forward to see how this project folds out. And yeah, over to you, Erica.
Hi, thank you, Leila. Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Kuligowski, and I'm a Principal Research Fellow at RMIT in the STEM College. I'm an interdisciplinary researcher with backgrounds in fire engineering and sociology. I've worked for a number of years conducting post-disaster studies, understanding the impacts of hazards on the built environment as well as community. And my research is primarily focused on how people make decisions during the response phase to protect themselves, particularly around household evacuation behavior. And I've also worked in community resilience as well, developing, when I worked for the US federal government, a community resilience planning guide for local governments. So, and my involvement in this project is primarily in, as Esther talked about too, the dissemination of the research outputs. So really excited to be here today to hear your feedback. Thank you.
Hello, very nice to meet you all virtually. My name's Anthony Kent. I'm a lecturer in the Sustainability and Urban Planning program. I'm also a member of the Centre for Urban Research. My broad research interests have to do with regional economic development, but also I've done some research on smart cities as well. And perhaps more specifically pertaining to this project, I've done work with Indonesian communities examining their resilience in the face of disasters, but also here in Victoria, looking at the response of farmers to disaster, in particular long-term drought.
I'll actually say a few words about Mittel because Mittel has teaching engagement or teaching commitment today and can't attend, unfortunately. But she brings knowledge and experience in housing disasters and longitudinal studies from a systems perspective to the project. She's a senior lecturer in sustainability and urban planning here at RMIT as well, at the School of Global, Urban and Social Studies. And she's a trained architect with 10 years industry experience. And her PhD research focused on linking housing reconstruction to community resilience in the long term. And I believe that research was mostly in India, but I'm not entirely sure. And yeah, then I'll hand over to Amanda.
Hi, thanks, Annette. Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda Lamont. I have a background in emergency management and disaster resilience. I've held various roles in government and not-for-profit and corporate sectors and NGOs, ranging from the local to the national to the global context in a humanitarian and disaster resilience perspective. Have a particular interest in understanding the complexity of urban environments, and particularly where nature and the environment sits within urban contexts, and how we understand the systemic approaches to building resilience generally and specifically in urban contexts from that focus. And I will be providing subject matter support to the project as we progress through.
And maybe just to mention the research team, so we've met everyone. We'll also have 2 research fellows where we're currently in the process of selecting candidates, doing interviews. There were some good candidates, so we hope we'll find some more good. So that's quite exciting. And we also have a few PhD students here at RMIT who are working in the disaster risk reduction space, urban complex systems, who are involved in the project in that sense that for them, it's a bit of an experience to understand how research projects work. And yeah, so that's also interesting. And then the translation and implementation panel and the project management committee, to which we'll come back later and which Blythe has already mentioned. So that's the overall project team. And then just with the approach, so the project will develop practical guidance, including tools where appropriate, so where we can actually do that, for assessing and mapping vulnerabilities and resilience within urban systems at local scales. Then we'll aim to develop guidance for operationalizing, monitoring, and evaluating urban resilience strategies, plans, and investments, and also suggest process principles and standards for prioritizing and influencing urban resilience investments. And you will see the same topics soon in our work packages, which we'll introduce now. So the project has 4 phases, work packages. John already mentioned he's the leader for work package 1. And I'll actually hand over directly to him so that he can talk a little bit what we're doing in that work package, and then we'll introduce the others.
Yes, thank you very much. The points on the screen indicates that we will be addressing the goals of work package 1, both through examining the literature and by talking with as many of you as we can. And perhaps if I were to list the sort of questions that we'll be asking you when we make arrangements to do that, we'll give an idea of the sort of outcomes that we're looking for. In work package 1, we're interested in what are the particular risks that flow from the fact that cities are quite complex systems, and how does this make the sort of disaster risks in the countryside and small towns differ from the particular risks or the scale or scope of those risks in cities? Because as you know, most of our experience in Australia has been in non-urban risk. We're also interested in that notion that disasters are cascading and one leads to another, and that they're compounding because of that. And that seemed to be characteristics particularly about urban hazard risks. So what does that mean about the selection of strategies? Can it just be a narrow range of tools that are used to build resilience, or do we need to look at it more comprehensively? And if so, how are we doing it in different parts of Australia? And what have we come to learn about the process of building resilience? Are we trying to reach a sort of desirable end state where everyone is safe? Or are we seeing more resilience more as a set of capabilities that individuals and communities and a whole country can have that would enable it to be more resistant to the effects of environmental risk? And of course, then what strategies have we found to be effective in building resilience? And what are the conditions for success in that? And perhaps to conclude, I'd like to say that while of course we'll have, you know, those academic outputs, but we're rather keen to take your guidance on how do we actually reorient the form of our reports so perhaps we have more of a toolkit type of output that enables the research that we do to be more easily reviewed, adapted, adopted, and therefore help increase urban resilience in Australia. Thank you, Annette.
Thanks, John. And I'll actually be leading work package 2, so I'll talk a little about that, and that's where it gets, I guess, more applied, or at least we're starting off more applied in the sense that we're doing a review of practices and processes for conceptualizing and mapping vulnerabilities and resilience within urban systems. So really looking at what is actually already out there, what are organizations using, what do they think is good or not so good, what is working. So we'll start with a document analysis of what is out there about the mapping, but also strategies for operationalizing resilience. We'll also do interviews and/or focus groups, and don't be afraid, we'll organize ourselves so we are not talking to 3 times to the same person. So we'll do some of the interviews together. Yeah, and this work package will also feed into work package 4, the dissemination and translation one, by based on the findings that we have. We'll develop a practical guidance tool, and will be testing this with a proof of concept case study. And again, that's where the stakeholders will come in, so we can actually see where we could test that, and also for, well, the input obviously on what is already out there. And then I'll go to work package 3, which I'll be also leading. So that's the focus on the resilience investment. So again, we'll be looking at what is already out there, what is done to, well, to invest in resilience, but also to prioritize actually urban resilience investment, and then also looking at monitoring and evaluation actually once the resilience investment has happened. Again, we know there's already quite a bit out there, so we'll be looking at that and talking to people to understand what kind of investment evaluation or monitoring they're using, how they're deciding about investments, to really get a broad picture. And then again, we'll be feeding into work package 4 by developing draft process principles and standards, and draft because then this will go further to stakeholders to discuss how these principles and standards could work. And yeah, therefore prioritizing investment, and then we'll also develop a draft guidance on monitoring and evaluation. And I'll hand over to Esther for work package 4 because yeah, she's leading that, and yeah, so we've already mentioned a few of the things, but she can talk in a little bit more detail about that.
I'm involved in work package 4, which is really built into the other 3 packages. And it's to do with the dissemination and translation of the findings and making them practical for the wide range of stakeholders involved. In addition to what are the sort of toolkits and guidelines, the websites, the podcasts, etc., that can come out of this, that can be practically applied to the wide range of industries and stakeholders in the project. I think that's really it. But again, how do we disseminate the research findings is sort of a critical part of the overall project framework. John, do you have anything to add on that? No. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, I was muted. No, it's all good. Thank you.
Thanks, Esther and John. Yeah, and it's really maybe just to say there's contribution to an ADA handbook mentioned there. This is something which was actually in the brief from the NHRA. So we'll see if we'll develop that or how it all turns out in the end. Yeah, so then we'll come to the stakeholder involvement. And again, Blythe has already talked a little bit about that. So we'll have a project management committee, which is really a bit of the governance process of the NHRA. So this is more about having stakeholders who are looking at our quarterly reports, if we are fulfilling our milestones, etc., and actually signing off at the end. So that's a bit more formal, let's put it that way. But yeah, it would still be great to have people on there, and actually to point out Paul Barnes is already on it. But we would like to have a few more. So we'll be asking later if anyone is interested in that, and maybe Blythe will later say a little bit more about how it works. And then we have the stakeholder advisory group or translation and implementation panel. It's the same thing. We just haven't really decided on the name yet. I think we are going with translation and implementation panel. But really what this group is about, getting feedback from stakeholders on, well, potential case studies, on the findings that we have, as John said before, the literature review, how people work in urban resilience. So really this is about, we'll be giving, presenting on findings, and then yeah, we would like to get feedback or ideas for further research. Nominating potential case studies. This is really about, well, if you think, oh, we have a great idea, this is a resilience investment tool that we're already using, or this would be a really interesting case study of a disaster in an urban system, please let us know. And then the fourth option is really getting updates on findings through webinars, website brochures, etc. So really we'll keep you updated on the project, but you don't need to be involved in any further meetings or feedback, etc. And as Blythe said, there will be a survey or a link to a survey where you can actually say what you would like to do, if you would like to be part of the translation implementation panel, or rather just get updates. So yeah. I think someone is not muted, so maybe, I'm not sure, John. I'm not sure if it's you, but I can see that you are not muted. Maybe someone else. Yeah, so this is really the stakeholder involvement, and then we'll come to the discussion. And actually, once I've stopped sharing the screen, I'll put those questions also into the chat so we can come back to them. But our questions really, well, do you have any comments or questions about the objectives and approach? Are there any extra priorities or key gaps we should be addressing? What topics or issues are most pressing in your area of work? Are there any recent challenges or promising approaches that fit this research? And are there any inputs you or your organization would like to contribute during the project?